Acclaims and Micronics? Oh, helly no. It's NES Works episode 56. A doubleheader of releases from Acclaim here, and despite the ominous intro, they're not that bad. In the early days of the NES, as you'll recall from our look at 3D WORLDRUNNER in episode 52, Acclaim specialized in localizing decent, if uninspiring, Famicom games from Japan. Both Tiger-Heli and Star Voyager fall squarely into this category. Neither is particularly great, but neither will you want to set fire to your NES either. The lack of setting NES on fireness of these releases may come as a surprise to you once you learn that the first of these two titles comes to us by way of our pals at Micronics. Last seen foisting upon the world the barely functioning ATHENA and IKARI warriors, we have every reason to cringe and dread at this latest effort. After all, Tiger-Heli calls to mind our very first encounter with Micronics, their butchery of Capcom's vertical shooter 1942. Given their dire track record, we have no reason to be optimistic about how this vertical shooter is going to turn out. And yet, it's not bad. You can definitely see the Micronics trademarks at play here, the sputtery frame rates at which the screen moves, the even jerkier movements of on-screen objects, the slightly out-of-tune music. Somehow, despite these flaws, Tiger-Heli actually plays fine. It's a slight game, and it doesn't offer much in the way of challenge or variety, but that's more a function of the source material than a failing of Micronics. Tiger-Heli puts players in command of a combat chopper making its way into what appears to be territory occupied by some unknown enemy. You pass over bases, forests, and deserts, but you also battle through civilian spaces as well. At first glance, this appears to be a riff on Xevious or Stinger, with both ground-based and aerial enemies and targets. It quickly becomes clear that this is nowhere near that complex an affair, though. Your chopper uses a single action button to fire on foes, and the programming doesn't make a distinction between the height of targets. Your secondary attack button fires bombs, of which you can only carry a maximum of 2 at a time. There's a reason for that limitation, and it's actually pretty inventive. The bombs you acquire both appear flanking your chopper's sprite, disappearing when fired. The bombs also double as shields of sorts. If any enemy projectile strikes the body of your chopper on a side equipped with a bomb, that bomb will detonate as it absorbs the hit, peppering foes with a spray of shrapnel while protecting the heli from the typical one-hit kill fatality. In practice, you can shield yourself from as many as 4 hits at a time. In addition to the bombs you can collect, you can also collect power-ups that summon up to 2 secondary mini-helis to flank your chopper. These can fire either forward or at a 90-degree angle to the side, depending on their color, which in turn is determined by the color cycle of the power-up capsules when you fire on them to activate them. As in 1942 and Stinger, these little mini-choppers will soak up an attack when hit. This makes Tiger-Heli a fairly forgiving shooter compared to the last vertical shooter Micronics churned out. The aim also moves at a fairly leisurely pace, giving players ample time to spot and react to enemies. Gun emplacements and tanks tend to be facing away from the player when they first scroll onto the screen, suggesting this whole affair is some sort of sneak attack or surprise rear assault, which means that turrets typically need to rotate 180 degrees before they can target the player with their lazy projectiles. As such, it's not too difficult to complete the 4 stages that comprise Tiger-Heli, even without making use of the built-in continue code. And once you finish stage 4, the end of the game is an infinite loop consisting of repeated trips through stages 2, 3, and 4. In short, this is a very small, slight game that really only offers a score attack as incentive to play, which is fine. Not great. Everything about Tiger-Heli is fine. Not great. Fine. It's here. It functions. That's about it. In arcades, Tiger-Heli was distributed by Taito, meaning this is the second Taito conversion we've seen, courtesy of Micronics. And as with elevator action, it's a fair bit better than Micronics' usual work. Maybe there was something about Taito games that brought out the developer's best. Incidentally, the original developer of the Tiger-Heli arcade release was Toaplan, one of the more beloved arcade shooter developers of the 80s and 90s. Their releases tended to be pretty obscure in the US. Even their viral meme favorite, Zero Wing, never saw an official US release. And that means Tiger-Heli is a fairly rare example of an American console Toaplan release. The next one we'll see, I think, is going to be Twin Cobra, which is a sort of sequel to Tiger-Heli. So please look forward to that in about 120 episodes. The second Acclaim released this episode isn't as enjoyable or approachable as Tiger-Heli, but it is at least interesting. Star Voyager sees the NES debut of Japanese developer ASCII Entertainment, a prolific computer publisher whose president helped establish the MSX computer platform. but which almost completely switched tracks from MSX to Famicom and NES a few years later in a remarkable show of faith in their own creation. ASCII often dealt in conversions or adaptations of US software properties. Their best-known release might be their port of Surtec's Wizardry, which series creator Robert Woodhead has described as the definitive rendition of that RPG classic. But ASCII published and developed hundreds of games in its lifetime, and we will see a lot of them on NES Works. In this case, Star Voyager, known in Japan as Cosmogenesis, stands as the NES's first rendition of the long-running first-person space sim genre. The overall concept behind Star Voyager actually dates all the way back to 1971 in Mike Mayfield's teletype game Star Trek. Yes, that's as in the TV series.
The voyages of the starship Enterprise.
Back in 1971, Star Trek had been off the air for just 2 years following its premature cancellation in 1969, and it was just beginning to experience the groundswell of fan support that would ultimately lead to its revival through a string of motion pictures. Mayfield's unlicensed and unauthorized game, created in the free and open environment of academic computing years before home computing was a thing, made use of the trappings of the TV series to create a new game genre. Players, taking the role of Captain James Tiberius Kirk, would warp the Starship Enterprise around different sectors of space to deal with the various threats they encountered there through a command line. This concept was polished up and given more of an action basis in 1979 with Atari's massive computer hit Star Raiders. It replaced the command line interface with a first-person combat view in which encounters with enemies, here the Battlestar Galactica-inspired Xylons rather than Trek's Klingons, played out through crosshairs and torpedoes. A few years later, Sega used the actual Star Trek license to create a pared-down, vector-style arcade game called Strategic Operations Simulation, in the style of Atari's Star Wars. So there's a lot of history here. In point of fact, Star Voyager was probably more directly inspired by Namco's Star Luster, one of the company's first notable original works for Famicom. Star Luster played similarly to Star Raiders, but worked with a 2-button NES controller rather than requiring a full computer keyboard. And it was a sizable hit in Japan when it launched, almost exactly 1 year earlier than the Cosmogenesis release of Star Voyager. Since localized Namco releases were pretty scarce on NES, Acclaim took advantage of the resulting vacuum to put this Star Luster clone into the US market. And, sure, here it is. Star Voyager revolves around 2 interfaces. First, there's a galaxy map in which you can scan space for the current positions of hostile forces relative to friendly space stations. This view is pretty abstract, but it's important because your goal is to protect your primary station from hostile incursions. The map view turns Star Voyager into something akin to a turn-based or time-based quest. Every leap you take from one sector of the galaxy to the next via map view, whether you're venturing to a planet for gear upgrades or confronting enemy forces in space, causes the invading force to advance along the map toward its goal. It's not a bad concept, but the other primary game interface, the cockpit view of your space fighter, leaves a lot to be desired. The NES wasn't really up to the challenge of rendering convincing first-person space combat, but in fairness, no system was at the time, really. Everyone really wanted to create an experience on par with Atari's Star Wars, but the NES lacked scalable vector visuals and a slick analog control yoke, which means that Star Voyager is no Star Wars, no matter how many ersatz TIE fighters it throws at the screen. You can boost your fighter with upgrades and tweaks to help fend off the enemy invasion, but combat still feels dull and involves lots of irritating sound effects. And the win-lose condition amounts to destroy all the enemies or allow an enemy to reach your main base. There's not a lot of subtlety or variety here. That said, there are some neat details in Star Voyager that indicate a certain degree of sincere love was probably invested into the whole package. I'm especially fond of the docking routine with space stations, in which you sync up with the station's rotation and the starfield around your ship begins to spin. But overall, it's a hybrid that doesn't quite pan out. As a shooter, it's dull and often frustrating. As a simulation, it's way too shallow. So Acclaim kind of phoned it in with both releases here. But where would a successful platform be without the middling mediocrity to flesh out the shelves at retail and give the true classics something to stand out again? I ask you. Next time on NES Works, a game worth 10,000 copies of Star Voyager, apparently.